This is Albert Camus. He said, "Your life has no inherent meaning, no preordained purpose, or God-given goal, and therefore life is absurd." Depressing, right? Well, yeah, it is actually. Right until he said, living in the face of that absurdity is the rebellion humans must ultimately do. I'm talking philosophy today, folks, and it will naturally get very bleak before it gets optimistic. So, enjoy. Before we kick this off, remember to take a moment to hit that pretty little subscribe button and ding that bell. Go on. Ding it. Albert Camus was born on the 7th of November 1913 in Mondovì, French Algiers, modern-day Trier, Algeria. Though second-generation French in Algiers, he was far from well off growing up. His father was a poor farmer who died in battle in 1914 during World War I, and so he grew up with his partially deaf mother, who sometimes couldn't get basic material possessions. A cruel irony, seeing as Camus' paternal grandfather, like many others in his generation, had moved to Algeria for a better life during the early decades of the 19th century. I'm sure there's a philosophy joke here. Anyhow, under the influence of his teachers, Camus gained a scholarship in 1924 to a prestigious high school near Algiers. In 1930, however, Camus was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a transmittable disease which forced him to move out of his home. It was at this particular time he began to turn to philosophy. He was greatly impressed by ancient Greek philosophy and Friedrich Nietzsche. Because, of course he was. Look at that manly moustache. Oh, okay. Yikes. Camus' interest in philosophy led him to enroll at the University of Algiers to study a BA in philosophy. Though he had developed somewhat of an interest in early Christian philosophy to begin with, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer paved his way toward the more pessimistic and atheistic philosophy he championed later on. And this is where we get his famous school of thought, absurdism. On a side note, Camus was actually a really fascinating guy, and not this entirely bleak and depressing guy you'd assume he'd be. He moved to Paris just before the outbreak of World War II, tried to join the army, but was rejected because of his tuberculosis, and so instead he wrote for an underground resistance movement against the Nazis during the French occupation. He was also friends with many other French intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone Beauvoir, André Breton, and was considered this charming and handsome sharp dresser in his adulthood. And after the war, instead of enjoying a quiet life in post-war France, he started slating on totalitarian communism, which had gripped the eastern part of Europe, whilst advocating libertarian socialism, which, although left him with fewer friends, completely cemented him in a book of total badass rebels who you probably didn't know about. I mean, come on. In Camus' most notable work, The Myth of Sisyphus, he set himself a very difficult challenge. Camus grappled with the seemingly meaninglessness of life and the apparent contradiction to keep living. Humans keep searching for the meaning of life, he noted, claimed that it is the ultimate question, and yet never find an answer. Camus asserted that humans never will, and because of that, there isn't a place where a person can hide from this perpetual existential dread. That's not to mention the fear of living a meaningless life, and the very temporary nature that comes with being human. Yet, the vast majority will continue to live. Camus asks, does a person realizing the meaninglessness and absurdity of life mean suicide? And the answer is, well, it's not so simple, as is typical of philosophy. Thanks, philosophy. Camus explores the question at great length. Firstly, he elaborates what exactly makes life absurd. We hope for a better tomorrow, Camus says, but each passing day brings us closer to our eventual and inevitable end. We spend so much time avoiding thinking about death, going as far as to romanticize it, beautify it, euphemize it, and ultimately hide it and from it. And even then, he explains, that is not what makes life absurd, because absurd does not exist in that alone. Camus explains it is the interaction when a person's need for understanding meets the unreasonable and inexplicable nature of the world. That is absurd. Which, when put in that way, yeah, it is quite absurd. Okay, so what is Camus' answer to his all-important question? Well, Camus remarked that there are three choices once a person acknowledges absurd. You can distract yourself with diversions and try to think about other things. You can give up and, or you can rebel. Yes, rebel. You can recognize the absurdity of life, but refuse to let it control your life and happiness, because ultimately life is in your own hands. Camus ultimately came to the conclusion of living a life full of passion and vigor despite it all. Or in his own words, thus I draw from the absurd three consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death, and I refuse suicide. And that is exactly how Camus lived right until his tragic demise in January 1960 at the age of 46. Which is probably why he did so many cool things in his life. Life is extremely fickle and confusing. Sometimes philosophy can be a great way of finding an approach to it. This, of course, is one of many. But I hope today you learned something valuable in one person's approach to life, if not just how depressing philosophy can get. Hey there, it's me, Drop. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this type of content, subscribe and press that bell button. It helps me keep doing these videos. If you just like watching videos made by an egg with too much time in his hands, like and comment down below. I appreciate your support. Until next time, Drop.